The day my daughter dropped my wife's passbook into a garbage bag, she did not hesitate for even a second. She picked it up, turned it over once in her hand, said 3 words that I will never completely unhear, and let it fall. The 3 words were, she had nothing. She said it like it was a conclusion she had reached long before that morning. She said it like the matter was already settled. She did not open the booklet. She did not read what was printed on the cover. She did not ask me what it was. She just made her judgment, made her decision, and moved on. I was standing in the doorway. I watched the whole thing happen in less time than it takes to read this sentence. And I said nothing. I let it go into the bag. I let the bag go out to the truck on Thursday morning. And 3 weeks later, when the letter from Coastal Community Credit Union arrived at my door and I read the number printed inside it, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving, because the woman my daughter had decided had quietly saved $214,000 and left every cent of it to me. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something real. If the person you trusted to help you through the hardest week of your life threw away something irreplaceable without looking at it, and later found out what it actually was, would you tell them immediately, or would you wait and let the truth do what you could not bring yourself to do? Lewis had to answer that question in real time in the middle of grief, with nobody watching him figure it out. Stay with this story because the answer he chose and what it cost him, and what it gave back to him is the whole point. My name is Lewis. I am 58 years old. I live in a house that has a kitchen I renovated too late and a garden I am still learning to keep alive without the woman who planted it. I spent 31 years as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant about 20 miles from where I was born. I am not a complicated man. I am direct. I am patient. I am the kind of person who would rather fix a problem quietly than describe it loudly. I have made many mistakes across the course of my life. I have stayed quiet when I should have spoken and spoken when I should have stayed quiet and been loyal past the point of wisdom more times than I can count. But I also loved my wife, Margaret, more steadily and completely than I have ever done anything else in my life, and that is not a small thing. That is the thing. That is the center of what I want to tell you. Margaret and I met at a neighborhood block association meeting when I was 36 and she was 34. I was there because the family 2 streets over had a dog that barked from 4 in the morning, and I was at the end of my patience with it. She was there because she had just moved into the area and believed, as she told me afterward, that the best way to understand a neighborhood was to show up to its meetings and pay attention to what people complained about. She sat 3 seats down from me. She had her hair pulled back simply, and she was wearing a pale green cardigan, and she was writing notes in a small notebook while other people spoke. I kept looking at her notes from the side. I could not read them, but she was writing fast and deliberately, and something about the concentration on her face made me want to know what she was thinking. After the meeting, she offered to share her notes with anyone who wanted a summary. 3 people took her up on it. I was one of them. We talked in the parking lot for 40 minutes. I missed dinner. I did not mind at all. Margaret was a woman who had built her whole life around a set of principles she never announced out loud, but that were visible in everything she did. She believed in not spending what you did not have. She believed in keeping things as long as they still worked. She believed in being on time and being prepared and knowing your own mind without needing to convince other people that you were right about things. She was not cold. She was the warmest person I have ever been close to. But her warmth was the kind that you had to notice rather than the kind that advertised itself. She would show up at your door with food when you were sick without calling ahead. She would remember a thing you mentioned once 6 months ago and follow up on it in a later conversation as if it still mattered, because to her it did. She paid attention in a way that most people do not realize is rare until they meet someone who does not have it. We dated for 2 years before I asked her to marry me. We were married for 21 years. Those 21 years were not perfect, because nothing across 21 years is ever perfect. We argued about the thermostat and the television volume and the way I left my work boots near the back door and the way she stacked too many things on the kitchen counter. We disagreed about some parenting decisio. And some money decisions and some decisions about how much time to spend with extended family. We went through stretches where we were too tired and too buried in ordinary life to be as close as we wanted to be. But underneath all of it, through every argument and every quiet patch and every difficult year, there was a trust between us that I never had to rebuild. It was just there. It held without being maintained. That kind of trust is the rarest thing I know. Before Margaret, I was married once before. Her name was Diane. We were young and the marriage was short, and what came out of it that mattered was my daughter Cassandra, who was born when I was 24. Diane and I separated when Cassandra was 6. Diane moved to a different city within a year of the separation, and the distance made regular parenting difficult in the practical sense. Cassandra came to live primarily with me. I raised her in the small house I rented before I bought the house Margaret and I eventually shared. I worked double shifts at the plant to make sure Cassandra had what she needed. I missed things that I wish I had not missed. I was at work for some school events and some birthday moments and some ordinary evenings that I know in retrospect mattered more than the overtime did. I cannot take those back. I carry them. Cassandra grew up to be a capable and professionally successful person. She works in marketing and has done well for herself. She has her own apartment, her own car, her own life. She's not a bad person. I want to be clear about that as early as possible in this story because what I am going to describe will make her look a certain way, and I do not want the complete picture to be missing. She is not a bad person. She is a person who made specific choices in specific moments that revealed something specific about how she had chosen to see the people around her. That is a different thing from being entirely bad, and it matters that I say so. Cassandra and Margaret were never close. I understood it from the beginning. Cassandra was 13 when Margaret came into our lives, and 13 is a complicated age under normal circumstances. She had feelings about her mother leaving. She had feelings about her father moving forward. She had feelings about having to share space and attention and the version of family she had known with someone new. I did not dismiss those feelings. I tried to give them room. But I also needed to build a life, and I had found someone worth building it with. And so we all had to navigate the reality of that. Margaret did not push Cassandra. I cannot say it enough. She was patient in a way that most people would not have sustained for as long as she did. She made dinner and left Cassandra's portion warm on the stove when Cassandra wanted to eat alone. She showed up to school events when Cassandra did not want her there and stood near the back and clapped and said nothing about the fact that she had come. She left small things on the counter for Cassandra without notes or expectations. A book she thought she would like. A tube of hand cream in a scent she had mentioned once. A pack of pens when Cassandra mentioned needing them. She never asked for credit. She never told me about these things after the fact to score points. I found out about most of them much later, in the way you find out about things a person did quietly only after they are gone. By the time Cassandra was in her late 20s and early 30s, the distance between her and Margaret had settled into something civil and maintained. Not warm, not close, but not hostile in the way it had sometimes been when Cassandra was a teenager. Cassandra came to holidays and spoke to Margaret in short and polite ways and left before the evening got too late. I told myself this was the best we could hope for. I told Margaret the same thing. Margaret looked at me with her steady eyes and said she was not asking for more than that. She just wanted Cassandra to know she was welcome. She said that across all 21 years without adjusting her position once, and I think that consistency was its own kind of love. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall, 14 months before she died. The diagnosis came from a routine checkup that turned out not to be routine. I was in the waiting room when the doctor came out. I watched his face as he walked toward me, and I knew before he spoke. I have replayed that moment in the waiting room many times. The particular quality of the air in that room. The sound of the television in the corner playing a home renovation program with the volume too low to hear clearly. The color of his jacket, the way he sat down in the chair beside me instead of standing. The year that followed was the most difficult year of my life. I say that knowing I have had other hard years. I say it with the full awareness that grief is not a competition and that other people have experienced things I cannot imagine. Boo. This year, watching Margaret move through treatment and decline, and the particular kind of exhaustion that cancer produces in a person who has always been vital and steady, was something that changed me in ways that I am still discovering. I did not leave her side much during those last 4 months. I took leave from the 2 consulting projects I had taken on after retiring. I let the house get more untended than it had ever been under Margaret's watch. I slept badly and ate inconsistently, and spent most of my energy simply being present because being present was the only thing she needed, and the only thing I could reliably give. Cassandra came to the hospital twice in those final months. Once in March when the treatment was still active and there was still language being used about response rates and options. And once in July, 3 days before Margaret passed. The July visit lasted 40 minutes. Cassandra stood near the doorway of the room more than near the bed. I noticed that. I did not say anything. I told myself that people approach death in their own ways and that being in the room at all was something. I believed that when I told it to myself. I am less certain now about what it meant. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in August. It was early, just after 5, when the light outside was still gray. I was holding her hand. The room was quiet. She had not spoken in 2 days, but she had responded to my voice with small movements for longer than that. The nurse on duty, a gentle and experienced woman named Patricia who had been with us through several shifts that week, told me afterward that she had seen this many times. She said the hearing often stays when everything else has gone. She said whatever I said in those last hours, Margaret heard. I think about that regularly. I hope it is true. I choose to believe that it is. Funeral was small and quiet. Margaret had been specific about this in the arrangements she had made the previous spring, during a period of clarity and practicality that I now understand was her way of handling what she could not control by handling everything she could. She had written down her preferences in a folder she left in the desk drawer labeled Final Arrangements, which she had quietly put together without telling me, and which I found only when I needed it. Even in that, she was prepared. Even in that, she had taken care of something before I knew I needed it taken care of. Cassandra came to the funeral. She sat beside me. She held my hand during the service, which I was grateful for. There were perhaps 30 people in total, colleagues of Margaret's from the medical practice where she had worked, neighbors, a few women from the Tuesday morning walking group she had kept for years. Sylvia, who had been part of that group, and who would tell me something important about Margaret many months later in the fasteners aisle of a hardware store, sat in the second row and cried without trying to hide it. I remember appreciating that. The openness of her grief felt like a tribute. After the funeral, after the small reception at the house, after the last people left and the leftover food was covered and the extra chairs were returned to the garage, Cassandra offered to come back the following Monday and spend a week helping me sort through the house. She said she had vacation time she could use. She said she wanted to help me start organizing things. She said it would be good for both of us to have something practical to focus on. I was grateful. I was depleted in the specific way that deep and sustained grief depletes a person, where your thoughts are slow and your arms feel too heavy and the simplest decisions require more energy than you have available. I said yes. I thanked her. I told her it meant a great deal. She arrived on Monday with 2 large cardboard boxes, a roll of tape, and a box of heavy-duty black garbage bags. She was organized from the moment she walked through the door. She moved through each room with a purposeful energy that I now recognize as something other than helpfulness, though I did not see it that way at the time. I was in survival mode. I needed someone to take the lead. She took it. She started with the living room and then moved to the spare bedroom and then the hallway closets. For most of this, I sat at the kitchen table and she would bring things out and ask me yes or no. Do you want this? Do you need this? What about this? And I would answer and things would go to one of the boxes or into one of the black bags. It was painful in the way all necessary things can be painful. The paperwork of a life, the collected objects. The small things that seem trivial until they belong to someone who is no longer there to give them context. On the 3rd day, she moved into our bedroom. I was at the kitchen table drinking coffee when I heard her open the drawer of Margaret's desk. The desk was a small wooden one she had brought with her when we first moved in together. It had 3 drawers and a surface that she kept organized with a wooden tray for pens and a small lamp and a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. I heard the first drawer slide open. I heard papers moving. I heard her sorting and stacking. Then I heard her open the second drawer, more papers. I heard her say, half to herself and half to the room, well, she did not have much going on paperwork-wise. Then I heard the rustling of the garbage bag. I got up from the table and walked to the bedroom doorway. Cassandra had a stack of papers on the desk surface that she was going through. She had already dropped several items into the open black bag at her feet. As I stood there in the doorway, I watched her reach into the stack and lift out a small green booklet. It was perhaps 5 inches tall and 3 inches wide. The cover had faded print on it that I could just make out from the doorway. She turned it over in her hand once. She looked at the cover for a moment that I counted later as being approximately 4 seconds. Then she let it fall into the garbage bag. I said, Cassandra. She looked up. She said, what? I said, what was that? She looked down into the bag and then back at me. She said it was an old bank book, one of those passbooks from a local credit union or something. She said those old credit union accounts usually had a few $100s in them at most, if anything at all, and that the estate attorney would sort out any financial accounts through the proper process. Then she said the words I have thought about every day since. She said she had no money, Dad. It's all trash. Don't worry about this stuff. We can handle the accounts properly later. She turned back to the desk. I stood in the doorway for a moment that felt longer than it was. I told myself she was probably right. Margaret had been careful with money, but she had never indicated any kind of significant savings, and the estate attorney had not flagged anything unusual. I told myself that if the account was real and active, it would surface through the proper channels the way everything else had. I turned and went back to the kitchen table. The bags went out to the truck on Thursday morning, two large black bags from the bedroom and the study. I watched through the kitchen window as the truck came and went. The contents of those bags went to wherever garbage trucks go, to a processing facility, to a landfill, to somewhere permanent and unreachable. And in one of those bags was a small green passbook belonging to my wife. Cassandra left on Friday. She hugged me at the front door. She said I was going to be okay. She said to call her if I needed anything. She said she was proud of me for getting through the week. Then she drove away, and the house was quiet again in the particular way it had been quiet since August. I spent the following 2 weeks in that foggy in-between state that anyone who has processed deep grief will recognize. I moved through the days. I made food I barely tasted. I slept in pieces. I walked the block in the evenings because Margaret had always said the best thing for a heavy head was moving air and different scenery, and I had nothing better to try. The mail accumulated on the counter in a pile I was working through slowly, opening only what looked urgent. On a Thursday afternoon, 23 days after Cassandra had left, I opened an envelope from Coastal Community Credit Union. It was addressed to the estate of Margaret, with a forwarding notation from the estate. The envelope was plain and business-sized. I opened it over the kitchen counter without much expectation. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first was a formal expression of condolences. It explained that the credit union had been notified of Margaret's passing through estate administration channels and was following up accordingly. The second paragraph informed me that as the named beneficiary on the account in question, I was entitled to claim the balance in full. The paragraph included a number. I read it once. I read it again. I set the letter down on the counter. I picked it up a third time and read the number a third time, not because I had not understood it, but because I needed to make it real in a way that 3 readings finally accomplished. $214,638.42. I did not move for a long time. I stood at the kitchen counter with the letter in my hand and the afternoon light coming through the window and the house completely silent around me. I thought about the small green booklet. I thought about Cassandra's hand lifting it and turning it once and letting it fall. I thought about the 4 seconds she had given it. I thought about the 3 words she had said with such certainty. She had no money. I thought about how certain she had sounded, how finished the judgment had seemed. I also thought about something else. I thought about how I had stood in the doorway and said nothing and let it happen. Not because I agreed with her, not because I did not care, but because I was grieving and tired, and I had let myself believe that a person who was trying to help me would not throw away something that mattered without at least checking first. I had extended a trust that had not been deserved in that moment, and the cost of that extension was that a piece of Margaret's history was gone in a way I could not fix. I did not cry at the counter. I had spent so much of the previous months crying that I was, for the moment, in a place beyond tears. What I felt was something quieter and more complex than sadness. It was close to reverence, because the number on that letter was not just a balance, it was a story. It was 40 years of deposits and discipline, and a woman who had decided early in her adult life that she was going to build something for herself with no fanfare and no assistance. And she had done exactly that, and she had put my name on it. I called the credit union the next morning when their offices opened. I spoke to a woman in member services whose name was Gloria. Gloria was thorough and careful and kind in a professional way that I was genuinely grateful for that morning. She confirmed the account balance. She confirmed that I was the sole named beneficiary and that this designation had been in place for many years. She explained that because the account was structured as a beneficiary account rather than a joint account, the balance transferred to me directly and outside the probate process. She told me what documents I would need to gather and said she would mail me a claim packet that day. She said the process typically took about 2 weeks once the documentation was submitted. I thanked her and ended the call. Inside the claim packet, which arrived 3 days later in a padded envelope, was a set of forms to complete, a list of required documents, and a small folded note on plain paper that had been kept in the physical account file at the credit union branch where Margaret had originally opened the account. It was a handwritten note in Margaret's clear and deliberate handwriting. It had been placed in the file at the time she updated the beneficiary designation, which according to a small notation on the note was 11 years into our marriage. The note said, "For Louis, when he needs steadiness more than noise. I hope it gives him options. I love him more than this account could ever say." I read that note standing at the kitchen counter. Then I sat down at the table. Then I read it again. I sat with it for a very long time. She had written that note 11 years into our marriage. She had updated the beneficiary designation and tucked a note into the file and said nothing about any of it to me for the rest of the time we had together. She had kept saving. She had kept the account separate from our shared finances. She had kept the passbook in a desk drawer under a folder of utility bills. And she had done all of this not in secret but in privacy, which is a different thing. It was privacy with a purpose. The purpose was written in her handwriting on a small folded piece of paper. For Louis, when he needs steadiness more than noise. She had known something about me that I had not fully known about myself. She had known that I was the kind of person who would redirect money meant for myself toward anyone else who appeared to need it. She had known that if she told me about the account, I would insist on using it for the house, or for Cassandra's needs, or for something communal that erased the personal gift of it entirely. She had known me well enough to protect me from my own instinct, and she had done it quietly across a decade and more without a word. I called my estate attorney, a careful woman named Patricia who had handled the estate administration since the beginning, and I told her everything. I told her about the credit union letter, the account balance, the passbook, and what Cassandra had done with it. I told her about Margaret's note. Patricia listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told me plainly that the money was mine, entirely and legally, with no claim that any other party could make on it. She said the beneficiary designation was unambiguous. She said the account was not part of the estate and had never been subject to any shared claim. She told me to get the claim submitted as quickly as possible and to have the funds transferred to my personal account as soon as the process allowed. Then she said something that I want to repeat exactly because I think it matters. She said, "Louis, I have been in this business for a long time. When people hear certain numbers connected to certain estates, their behavior changes in ways they do not always recognize in themselves. I am not telling you to distrust your family. I am telling you to complete this process quickly and to be careful. All about what you discuss with anyone until the funds are in your account and the process is finished." I said I understood. She said document every conversation in the meantime. Date, time, who said what, just in case. I said I would, and I did. 2 days after my first call to the credit union, Cassandra called me. Her tone was different from any version of it I had heard in recent months. It was softer, more careful. She said she had been thinking about how she had left things and she wanted to come by soon and spend some time together. She mentioned the kitchen and how she had always loved cooking there. She mentioned the garden and how she had noticed it was getting overgrown. She said she thought it would be good for both of us to reconnect and that she missed spending time with me. The conversation was warm and generous, and I listened to all of it while standing at the kitchen counter with Margaret's note sitting on the table behind me. I told her I appreciated the thought. I said I would let her know when felt like a good time. I did not mention the credit union. 4 days after that, I received a call from Diane, my first wife and Cassandra's mother, who I had not spoken to in several months. The call started with pleasantries and a question about how I was doing, and then moved fairly quickly into a mention of estate matters. She used the phrase financial matters twice in a call that lasted less than 10 minutes. She said she had heard things were being sorted out, and she just wanted to make sure I had good people around me. I kept the call brief. I thanked her and ended it, and added the time and details to the document Patricia had told me to keep. Then came the text from Cassandra that changed my understanding of the situation considerably. She asked if she could bring a friend when she came to visit. She described this friend as someone who worked in financial planning and who had been incredibly helpful to her with her own planning recently. She said it might be good to have someone who understood these things sitting with us to talk through options together. She said it casually, almost as an afterthought at the end of the message, but it was not an afterthought. I knew when I read it that it was the whole point of the message. I held the phone and read that text several times. I thought about the warm call 2 days before. I thought about Diane's call and the phrase financial matters said twice. I thought about Cassandra at the desk, the passbook, the 4 seconds, the garbage bag. I thought about Patricia's words. When people hear certain numbers, their behavior changes in ways they do not always recognize in themselves. I did not respond to the text that day. I called Patricia instead. I read her the text. She said what I had already started to understand. She said it sounded like someone was attempting to position themselves near financial decisions that were not theirs to be near. She reiterated everything she had said before. Complete the claim, transfer the funds, be private, be steady, document everything. I followed her advice precisely. I submitted the claim documents. I waited the 2 weeks. I received confirmation of approval. The funds transferred into my personal account on a Tuesday morning. $214,638.42, sitting in my account quiet and real and entirely as Margaret had intended. I waited 3 more days after the transfer before I called Cassandra. When she answered, she was warm again. She asked how I was. She asked how things were going with the estate. I said things were handled. She asked about visiting. She asked if her friend from financial planning could come along. I said I wanted to talk about something first. I told her plainly. I told her that the credit union account she had not known about was real, the balance was significant, and it had transferred to me as the named beneficiary. I told her the process was complete. I told her the funds were in my account. I told her I had been working with my attorney and my own financial advisor throughout, and I did not need any additional guidance. There was a silence on the line that had a particular texture to it. Then she asked the amount. I told her. She was quiet for a longer stretch this time. Then she said, "Dad, I was trying to help you. I know how overwhelmed you have been, and I just thought having a professional perspective would be useful. I was not trying to overstep." I said, "I know you are not trying to overstep, and I want you to hear me clearly right now. This money belonged to Margaret. She saved it across her whole adult life. She named me as the person she wanted to have it. I am going to honor her decision the way she made it, privately and according to my own judgment. Your friend is welcome to help you with your own planning, but they are not going to be part of what Margaret left for me." Cassandra said she understood. The call ended shortly after that. Not with heat, not with a shouting match, just with a particular kind of quiet that tells you something has shifted between two people who will now need to figure out how to be in relation to each other going forward. I did not hear from her for several days. During that time, I heard from Derek, a cousin of Cassandra's on Diane's side of the family who I had always gotten along with reasonably well. Derek called under the guise of checking in, but moved within minutes into questions about my plans and my support system, and whether I had thought carefully about the future. He said the family just wanted to make sure I was okay. He said it in the tone people use when what they really mean is that the family is aware that something is happening and wants to understand it. I thanked him for calling and ended the call and added it to my document. Then I heard, through a neighbor who mentioned it carefully and apologetically, that Cassandra had been telling people in her social circle that I had inherited a large sum from Margaret and was struggling emotionally and not thinking clearly. I had no way to confirm this directly. It came to me secondhand. But it had the shape and timing of everything else, and I did not dismiss it. I called Patricia again and told her. She absorbed it without surprise. She asked if the financial process was complete. I said yes. She said then the most important thing now was simply to live my life according to my own values and choices, and to stop engaging with any attempt to position people near my decisions. She said money is a clarifying event for family dynamics. It tends to reveal what has always been true. She said the best thing I could do was continue being the person I already was. She said it matter-of-factly, but it landed with weight. I want to take a moment here and talk about what I actually did with the money because I think it is important, and because I think Margaret would want it told honestly. I did not spend it on anything loud or dramatic or sudden. I sat down with my own financial advisor, Walter, who I had worked with for several years, and I made a set of decisions that felt right, and that I believe Margaret's note was pointing me toward. I paid off the remaining balance on my house. It was not enormous, but it was real, and it was done, and the feeling of owning the house completely, without a payment attached to it, was something I had not fully expected to feel as significant as it did. But it felt like solid ground beneath my feet in a way that was genuinely different from before. I put a portion aside for long-term care insurance, which every person in their late 50s should have, and which I had been unable to fund fully on my pension alone. I had been putting this off for 2 years and telling myself I would get to it. Margaret's money got me to it. I set aside a fund for the kitchen and bathroom renovations that Margaret and I had talked about for years and that I had always been about to get to in some next season that never quite arrived. I hired contractors. The kitchen renovation started in October. I kept the largest portion in a carefully managed account that Walter helped me structure for steady long-term access, rather than a one-time windfall dynamic that would not serve me well and that Margaret, who understood steady accumulation better than anyone I had ever known, would not have wanted for me. And I made one more decision that I want to tell you about specifically. Margaret had quietly donated for years to a small local organization called Anchor Futures, which provided school supplies and after-school support for children from lower-income families. I found records of her regular small donations in a folder in the desk that Cassandra had not thrown away. She had given $25 to $50 at a time, consistently, for many years, without ever mentioning it to me. I called the organization and made a contribution in her name. It was enough to fund their back-to-school supply drive for the next 3 years. I asked them to install a small dedication plaque in their resource room. It reads, "In memory of Margaret. She believed in steady, quiet kindness." She was right. I did not tell Cassandra about the plaque. I did not tell her about the house payoff or the insurance or the renovations or the fund structure. Not as punishment, not as a power play. Simply because it was my money and my life and my decisions, and because what Margaret had saved was never meant to be a communal event. It was meant to give me options. I used them. About 5 weeks after the financial transfer was complete, Cassandra sent me a long text message. She said she had been thinking. She said she understood that legally the money was entirely mine, but she wanted to remind me that family was larger than legal categories. She said that the years I had worked double shifts to provide for her were years when I had been building a foundation she had benefited from. She said that some of what I had built across my life had been sacrificed for her, and that some acknowledgement of that shared history would feel appropriate. She was careful with her wording. She did not say she was entitled to the money. She said some acknowledgement. She said some of what you built was for me too. I read that text in full. I set the phone down. I made coffee. I drank it. Then I wrote back, and I want to tell you exactly what I said because it was one of the clearer things I have ever put into words in my life. I wrote, "Cassandra, I have read your message carefully. I want to respond honestly. First, the money Margaret saved was hers entirely. She earned it before me, saved it alongside our marriage, and chose to leave it to me in writing. That is not a family discussion. It is her final decision, and I am honoring it. Second, the years I worked double shifts for you were years I would give again without hesitation. They were not deposits into an account. They were love, and love given genuinely does not come with a later invoice. Third, and I want you to sit with this without feeling attacked by it, you dropped Margaret's passbook into a garbage bag because you decided in 4 seconds that she had nothing worth your attention. The money was still in the account and I could still claim it, so you were right that it was not destroyed in any practical sense. But what you showed in that moment was that you had already decided a long time ago what Margaret was worth to you, and the verdict was not a kind one. I am your father and I love you, but I am not going to ask your permission to honor the woman who quietly built something across her whole life and put my name on it. I hope that is clear." I wrote that in a notes app and looked at it for almost an hour before I sent it. Then I sent it as written. She did not respond for 5 days. During those 5 days, something happened that I had not expected. I ran into a woman named Sylvia at the hardware store. Sylvia had been part of Margaret's Tuesday morning walking group. She had cried openly at the funeral. She was a person who had genuinely known and loved Margaret as a friend. She stopped me in the fasteners aisle, and after some ordinary words about how I was doing, she said she had something she had been meaning to tell me. She said that on their walks, Margaret had sometimes talked about money, not in a boastful way, in Margaret's characteristic quiet way. She said Margaret had mentioned an old account she had kept since she was a young woman. She said Margaret called it her steadiness account. She said she kept it because she had grown up watching her mother keep a small private savings, and she had understood from that example that money kept separate, and quiet was money that could not be borrowed against or redirected or spent on emergencies before it had a chance to become something real. Sylvia said that Margaret had told her she intended the account for me. She said Margaret had used the exact phrase, "a soft landing." She had said she wanted to make sure Louis had a soft landing if she went first, because Louis was the kind of man who took care of everyone else without taking care of himself, and she wanted to make sure something was in place for him before she was gone. I stood in the fasteners aisle and did not say anything for a moment. Sylvia squeezed my arm and said she loved you very specifically, Louis. Not generally, Specifically, the way you love someone when you know them. I thanked her. She went on with her shopping. I stood in the aisle for another minute or two before I could move on. Soft landing. I had the phrase in my head all the way home. I kept turning it over. Margaret had built me a soft landing from 40 years of $25 and $50 deposits. She had done it without telling me because she knew I would redirect it. She had known that about me with a precision that I was only now beginning to fully understand. She had loved me not as a broad and general thing, but as a specific person with a specific weakness that needed to be specifically protected. And she had done something about it across 4 decades without saying a word. Cassandra responded to my message on the 5th day. Her response was 3 sentences. She said she understood my position. She said she did not agree with all of it. She said she hoped we could find a way forward. There was no mention of the passbook, no mention of the 4 seconds, no mention of the 3 words. The focus of her message was forward, which told me exactly what I needed to know about how she was processing what had happened. I replied and said I was always open to an honest relationship, and that forward movement started with backward honesty when backward honesty was owed. I said I was ready for that conversation whenever she was. She did not reply to that one. The kitchen renovation started in October. It was a substantial project. The old nets came down. The old countertops came off. There was a 2-week period in the middle when the kitchen was completely gutted, and I was eating sandwiches at the table in the bare room surrounded by plaster dust and exposed wiring. And I remember sitting there one evening looking at the empty space where the kitchen had been and thinking about all the times Margaret had stood in that room. The way she moved around it efficiently. The things she cooked and how they smelled. The way she wiped the counter after every meal even when she was tired. I thought about how many times I had said, maybe next year for the renovations. I thought about how she had died without seeing it done. But I also thought about how it was getting done. It was getting done because of what she had quietly built. It was getting done because she had seen 40 years ahead and named me as the person she wanted to have the option. The kitchen was being made right because Margaret had always believed in making things right even when the timing was difficult. Standing in the wreckage of the old kitchen that was becoming a better one, I felt her presence more clearly than I had at any point since the funeral. The plumber who came to redo the pipes was a man named Roy, maybe 65, with large, rough hands and a careful, explanatory style that I found reassuring. At one point, he looked up from under the sink cabinet and said, "You doing all of this for yourself, or you got people coming to share it?" I said mostly for myself, but I hoped my daughter would come around enough to enjoy it too someday. Roy nodded slowly and said, "In my experience, people do not appreciate a place until it has been made into what it always should have been. Then they wonder why it took so long." I thought about that sentence for a few days after he left. In late November, about 6 weeks after the funds had transferred and the renovations were well underway, Cassandra reached out and asked if she could come and visit. Not with the financial planner friend, just her. She said she wanted to bring dinner and spend an evening together the way they used to. I agreed. She came on a Saturday with a roasted chicken from a restaurant I liked and a salad and a bottle of sparkling water. We sat in the partially renovated kitchen, which still had its new countertops installed but was waiting on the cabinet facing. And we ate at the table in that half-finished room in a way that felt more honest than many of our dinners in completed rooms had felt. After the food, over coffee, she said she had something she wanted to say. She said she had been thinking about everything that had happened and about her relationship with Margaret over the years. She said she knew she had not been easy. She said she recognized she had spent a long time telling herself that Margaret was not truly part of the family because it was easier to believe that than to examine the complicated feelings underneath it. She said she knew she had not shown up the way she should have during the illness. She said she felt guilty about those things now that the chance to do differently was gone. She said it carefully and specifically, and with what felt like genuine discomfort, which I have always found more trustworthy than polished regret. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I appreciated her saying it. I told her I did not need her to have been different with Margaret in order to still be my daughter. I said I understood the history of how they had come together, and I had made my peace with how it had gone. But then I said the thing I needed to say. I told her that what I needed going forward was for her to understand one thing clearly and to let it stay clear. I said that the money Margaret had saved was mine, and what I did with it was my decision, and was not a conversation that involved anyone else. I said if she wanted to be in my life as my daughter, I wanted her there. But I was not going to manage my choices around anyone's interest in them. I said it without anger. in the even tone of someone who has thought a thing through enough times to have settled it completely before speaking. She said, "I understand, Dad," and she looked at me when she said it in a way that was different from how she had looked at me in recent months. It was less calculating. It was closer to genuine. I chose to take it at face value. What unfolded over the following months was quieter and more gradual than the drama of the previous ones. Cassandra and I continued to be in each other's lives. The conversations were careful and sometimes warm and sometimes had a careful distance to them that I accepted as the honest consequence of what had happened. I did not expect transformation overnight. I did not need it overnight. What I needed was for my own life to feel honest and grounded, and it did. The kitchen was finished by December. The new cabinets were clean and the countertops were solid, and the Y. Endow over the sink looked out at the garden in the same way Margaret's old window had. I stood at that window the evening the renovation was complete and looked out at the garden in the dark, at the raised bed where the tomatoes had gone wild and the herbs had overgrown, and I felt the particular weight of a thing that was finally finished. I had promised Margaret I would get to this kitchen. It had taken me longer than it should have, and it had taken money she had saved without telling me, and it was done now, and that had to be enough. Cassandra came to see the finished kitchen in March. She walked in and looked around without speaking for a moment. She ran her hand across one of the new countertops. She stood at the window and looked out at the garden, which I had begun to tend again now that the cold was lifting. She said quietly, mostly to herself, she would have loved this. And then she caught herself and said, "I mean Margaret, she would have loved this kitchen." The self-correction told me something. She had thought of Margaret first and naturally and then caught herself doing so, as if the automatic thought needed to be explained. It was a small thing, but small things are often the most telling ones. We had coffee in the new kitchen. She asked about the charity dedication she had heard about from someone connected to the organization. She did not ask for details. She just said she thought it was a lovely thing to do and that she thought Margaret would have been touched by it. I said Margaret would have been a little embarrassed by the plaque, but would have been glad the money went to children who needed supplies. Cassandra smiled at that. It was a real smile, not a managed one. Something shifted in that kitchen over that coffee. I do not want to overstate what it was. It was not a resolution. It was not a transformation. It was more like a beginning of honesty between two people who had been circling something real for a long time and were finally standing close enough to it to feel its edges. Cassandra began to speak, over that visit and across several visits that followed, about what she had held against Margaret. She said it came out in pieces across months, not in a single confession, but the accumulation of it told a clear story. She had resented Margaret for being present. She had decided that Margaret's presence was a replacement for something rather than an addition to it. She had convinced herself that Margaret had not contributed to the family because believing that was easier than examining how much Margaret had actually given without making a production of it. She had decided, without ever quite saying it to herself in those exact words, that Margaret was not worth her full attention. The passbook was the visible version of that decision. The passbook was Margaret in small green paper, everything she had built quietly, and it had been lifted and turned over and dropped in 4 seconds because Cassandra had already decided before she picked it up that it had no value. That is not a mistake of carelessness. That is the result of a conclusion reached long before the evidence was examined. Cassandra never quite said that directly. She got close to it. She talked about being hasty during that week. She talked about the stress of it. But she never stood directly in front of the passbook moment and said plainly, "I dismissed it because I had already dismissed her, and that was wrong." I did not push her to that place. She would have to get there on her own. Some truths travel slowly, and pushing them faster than a person is ready for often pushes them further away rather than closer. What I know after all of it is this. I know that quiet people are not small people. I know that a woman who never announced what she built and never asked for credit and never needed you to know her bank balance was not a woman with nothing. She was a woman with everything that mattered, which was discipline and love and a specific understanding of the person she had chosen to spend her life with. I know that the measure of what a person has built is not visible in their clothes or their car or the volume of their life. I know that a small green booklet in a desk drawer can contain more love than most people express in a lifetime of loud declarations. I know that my daughter made a decision in 4 seconds that revealed something she had been carrying for years, and that the consequence of that decision was not the loss of the money, because the money was never in the booklet, but the plain and visible fact that she had looked at Margaret's things and decided before looking that they were not worth looking at. That is a specific kind of dismissal. It has nothing to do with passbooks or credit unions or balances. It is about who you decide someone is before you have any information to justify the decision. And I know more than anything else I have come out of this story knowing that Margaret was right about me. She was right that I would have redirected the money. She was right that I needed something in place before I knew I needed it. She was right that the best way to give me options was to give them to me quietly and specifically, in the way she did everything that mattered to her. She wrote that note 11 years into our marriage and kept it in an account file and said nothing about it for the rest of the time we had. And when she was gone, the note arrived with the claim packet and told me exactly who she had always known me to be. For Louis, when he needs steadiness more than noise. She gave me steadiness after she was gone. She gave me options. She gave me the paid-off house and the long-term care plan and the renovated kitchen and the charity plaque and the steady account and the capacity to say no to a financial planner I had never met who was going to come to my home and help manage my choices without being invited. She gave me the ability to stand in the doorway of my own life and say, "This is mine, and I know what to do with it, and I do not need you to tell me." She gave me a soft landing. I am still using it. I am still landing gently and steadily in the life she wanted me to have after her. The kitchen is right. The garden is coming back. The house is paid off. The mornings are quiet. I make my coffee the way she taught me, stronger than I used to make it. And I sit at the table in the good light. And I let the house be what she always made it, which was a place where care was built into the structure of the daily ordinary, into the receipts filed and the herbs kept, and the drawer with everything in its right place. The bank called, and the bank had a different answer than my daughter had. $214,638.42, built $25 and $50 at a time, across 40 years of steady Tuesday deposits by a woman who never once said, "Look what I have done." She just kept doing it. That is who Margaret was. That is what Cassandra missed. That is what Louis finally, fully understands. Before you go, I want to leave you with one thought that Louis's story kept bringing me back to. Think about the people in your life right now who give without announcing it. The ones who build things slowly and carefully and say nothing about what it costs them. The ones who show up in the background of difficult weeks and difficult years without asking to be recognized for it. How often do you look at what they have actually given you, really look, instead of assuming you already know the value of it? Louis did not get to thank Margaret the way he wished he could, but he honored her in every single choice he made after she was gone. Drop a comment and tell me about someone who gave quietly and deserved more than a 4-second glance. Louis's story is for every person who was underestimated before the truth had a chance to speak.